Good morning, my name is Anja Burkhardt. I'm from Austria, from the University of Graz. And Carmen has asked me to sort of guide you through this morning, to announce the plenary speakers and also to see to it that we keep to the timetable. I've just realized we are already 15 minutes late, but of course David is going to have his 30 minutes for his first plenary. So I have the pleasure to announce our first plenary speaker, David Little from Trinity College Dublin. And David is going to talk about the essence of learner autonomy, learning a language from the inside out.
Okay. It's very nice to be among you at yet another of these Nordic conferences, workshops, seminars, whatever they are. When Leni showed the list, I realized that this is my 6th out of 11. I was in touch the other day with a colleague in Canada who said, I knew my geography was a bit dodgy, but Nordic in San Sebastian? If you find the local language impenetrable, don't despair. When I was here on one previous visit, I realized that it's actually quite straightforward. If you stay long enough in the touristy parts, you will see one of these mock trains that runs on the street going by. They go from the aquarium. And if you look at the front, it says TXU, TXU, choo-choo, and that's bicycle train. Now, the essence of language learner autonomy. Learning a language from the inside out. Have I pressed the wrong button? Yes. Let me begin by pointing out, or perhaps reminding you, that in the literature there are 2 quite distinct versions of learner autonomy. Now, both versions have certain key features in common. According to both versions, learners set their own goals, they choose their own learning activities and materials, they monitor the learning process and they evaluate learning outcomes. But version 1 sees language learning and the development of learner autonomy as 2 quite separate things that run on parallel tracks. That's the view of learner autonomy that Henri Olek introduced in his report for the Council of Europe back in 1979. It's the view of learner autonomy that has been very influential, I think, around the world at university level. And it is the version of learner autonomy that has encouraged research into autonomy independently of developing proficiency in the target language. Because it sees autonomy and language learning as running on parallel tracks, this notion of learner autonomy doesn't include a theory of language acquisition, and that helps to explain why it has always been of no interest to applied linguistics. Version 2 sees the development of learner autonomy as inseparable from the development of proficiency in the target language. That is key to Leni's work, and it's something that I've tried to tease out in a principled or quasi-theoretical way in a number of publications, perhaps most excessively the article I published in the inaugural issue of Innovation in Language Learning and Teaching back in 2007. This version of learner autonomy attributes the development of proficiency to learners' exercise of agency in and through the target language. In her introduction, Leni ordered us to continue to abide by the so-called Bergen definition. What is missing in that definition is any element that links the concept of learner autonomy to the business of language learning. I see people slavishly writing down, don't. There is a handout, and I should have mentioned that at the beginning. So all the text you see on the screen in a slightly different format will become available. There's no reason why it shouldn't be passed around now if you want to. So, two versions of learner autonomy, and the one that my title already implies I'm going to be interested in is version 2. Let me now draw your attention to two views of language learning. There's the traditional, as they call it, communicative view. According to that view, the target language is somewhere out there. You've got a community of native speakers. You mediate the language to your learners via perhaps a textbook. You've got to provide your learners with input and activities of various kinds, but often simply driven practice, that will help them to process the input cognitively between their heads. And the most that we can really do as teachers, according to this view, though such pessimism is rarely admitted, is to develop learners' capacity to communicate as if they were outside the classroom. And then we hope that when they are outside the classroom, they will indeed be able to communicate. There's plenty of evidence to show that that's not a very successful approach. Contrast with that what I would call the learner autonomy view, version 2. That focuses on the learners here and now. The teacher and learners create a self-transforming community of target language users. Classroom activity depends on the learner's agency, which from the very beginning is channeled through the target language. So agency through the target language. That's again picking up on what I identified as a key element in this second version of learner autonomy. And it's in this sense that it seems to me one can elaborate this conceit that learning is from the inside out. Learning is a matter of a process of unfolding, of development within the learner because of capacities that the learner has, can't help having, under the impact, of course, of certain environmental influences and pressures. I'll just say a little bit more about my understanding of what I'm calling learner autonomy version 2. It seems to me that learners already know, at least implicitly, that's to say unconsciously, without being aware of it, what it is to behave autonomously. They're agents of their own lives outside school. Anyone who is a parent, anyone who has for 5 minutes had the care of a small child, knows that human beings always have their own agenda. On Sunday, I was warned that our eldest granddaughter, who will be 9 next month, had opened a Gmail account as her parents' suggestion to deflect her from the notion of needing a mobile telephone. And therefore we were all going to be in receipt of emails. And I had several exchanges with her in the course of Sunday, and then thought, wouldn't it make her feel good if when we washed up in San Sebastian, I sent her an email and said, tell your mum and dad that we're safely in Spain and that we've got a hotel room with a beautiful sea view and the sun is shining and it's not raining. I did this. There was absolutely no response. And yesterday evening, I sent my daughter a text message saying, what about the email that I sent Lucy? She said she was banned from email for being rude. And you see, that's how we have to behave as parents, because we're up against autonomy. What we have to do as teachers, for me, is not turn learners from being teacher-directed to being self-directed. We want them, of course, to be self-directed, but we have to extend the capacity they bring to the classroom for autonomous behaviour to the business of learning and using and learning the target language. And this, of course, entails helping to make their autonomy explicit, helping them to understand that they have it and how they need to develop and use it. We do it by giving them co-responsibility for planning, monitoring and evaluating learning, and by ensuring that all learning activity is embedded in reflection, which means, of course, metacognitive talk in the target language. In enacting this kind of learning dynamic, our first order tool is communicative and metacognitive target language use. From the first, I'm making the point now for the third time, the target language is a channel of the learner's agency. And our second order tools, which mediate the first order tool, which make that first order tool a reality, are things like logbooks and posters, learner-created learning materials, learner-generated texts, and so on and so forth. The skillful introduction and use of those tools and activities are what makes it possible for learners precisely to be agents of their own learning through the target language. So what am I trying to do in this talk? Well, I want to explore further, obviously, this idea that autonomous language learning is learning from the inside out, but I want to do it with particular reference to the findings of neuroscience relative to formal learning in general. Some of you, I know, were at the IATEFL conference. I was there only for the pre-conference event, having decided that I wasn't going to spend my own money listening to things I didn't want to hear in the first place. But subsequently, I watched the plenaries online, because you can always do that for IATEFL, and I watched James Zoll's talk. And it wasn't entirely successful, because I don't think he got beyond his third PowerPoint slide. But as he spoke, I thought that he probably got things that chimed in pretty well with the kind of things that I'm interested in. And I was then stimulated, having flicked through his PowerPoint presentation, which was put on the IATEFL website, I was then stimulated to buy his two books. The first one, this one, I then immediately read and found myself annotating, and the comment I kept making in the margins was from the inside out. It seemed to me that so much of what he was talking about, often in a rather general way, chimed with the sense I have of learner autonomy being a matter of learning from the inside out. This is the kind of thing that Zoll writes. Biology shows the essential entanglement of learning with life. This clarifies the meaning of intrinsic motivation and shows the fundamental inadequacy of extrinsic rewards. Learning is seen as a natural outcome of experience. It's one thing to have a theory that learners construct their own understandings by building on what they already know, and quite another to actually see how this construction happens, to understand the physical process by which networks of neurons grow more complex through sensory experience. And what that is pushing towards is an acceptance of the fact that all these learners that through a teaching career we have to engage with as individuals and as members of groups are complex, holistic beings. They are not clusters of capacities such as scientists like to attempt to measure. But underlying this talk is also the idea that language development, better talk of development in the kind of autonomy classroom I'm interested in than of learning. Language development is a matter of autopoiesis. That's to say, it's a matter of spontaneous, autonomous unfolding of a capacity to communicate in a language that comes from the inborn capacities of the learners, of course under the impact of environmental factors. I could have chosen a quotation to illustrate the kind of thing I'm focused on here from many different writers working in different strands of the so-called social turn of second language acquisition theory. When I was preparing the talk, I happened quite recently to have read Diane Larson-Freeman's little article on complexity theory in this newly published Routledge Handbook of SLA. And this is what she says about this social turn, about the impact of complexity theory. The shift from innatism to emergence, from a top-down process of computation to a bottom-up process of self-organization, autopoiesis, from rules to patterns, from a static system to a dynamic one, from universal to contextually sensitive behavior, and from stability to transience, all reflect a profound shift of perspective. Now, this is just an undertone in my talk, because this is where second language acquisition theory is moving, but it's where my version of learner autonomy has been for several decades. I want to begin the remainder of this talk by focusing on this idea that learners are persons. You may say, well, it stands to reason they are. Of course it does, if you're a parent or a co-learner or an uncle or an auntie or whatever it may be. And it should do if you're a teacher. But if you're an applied linguist, you may not think of them as persons at all. Philip Riley put the matter very nicely when he was speaking at a symposium we organised in Dublin back in 2003, arguing that the very concept of learner autonomy derives from the view that each learner is a person consisting of a self with a social identity. A person consisting of a self with a social identity. And second language learning, according to Learner Autonomy version 2, implicates every dimension of the person. This is what James Zoll has to say. One thing we can be sure of is that the neuronal networks in student brains are related to their own life experience. The things they've seen, heard, touched, smelled and tasted are what connect for them. And things they've tried to do or have succeeded in doing will also be there. There are neuronal networks for the facts of their own lives. In the process of learning, of course, the different dimensions of the person interact in numerous complex ways. And I want to use up the remainder of my time looking rather quickly at some of those interactions. The various things I'm going to talk about, I don't think necessarily of as being an exclusive list, and they don't exclude one another from a total model. So I'm not saying here's a taxonomy. I'm just saying here are a number of dimensions or perspectives that help us to come to grips with this. First thing I want to focus on is what Philip Riley talked about, the social self, or rather individuals being selves with social networks and all the rest. I want to talk about identity. What is the identity that learners bring with them to the classroom? Well, what they bring is socially situated experience and knowledge. That's one way of describing what our identity is. old knowledge is something that we have talked about for many, many years in learner autonomy circles, especially at these workshops. The importance of exploiting the old knowledge, the things learners already know, in order to develop new knowledge. James Zoll talks about prior knowledge being a fact, persistent, but also the beginning of new knowledge. He says we must let our students use the neuronal networks they already have, which is a biological way of making the point that Douglas Barnes made in his book back in 1976. We continually add new experiences to our old ones, as Zoll says. We blend the old and the new, and in blending we create whole new networks. We construct our understanding using part of what we already know and part of what is new. Well, as I've already said, in learner autonomy circles, there's nothing new about that, but it's interesting to have it so explicitly confirmed from a neuroscientific basis. I think it's important when talking about identity, though, to make this point, that our identity is both implicit and explicit. It's something we are consciously aware of, but it's something that is part of us and we may not be aware of. So we're not necessarily conscious of everything we know or the full implications of our past experience. And the people who are beginning now to argue against taking account of learners' identities and so on by saying, you know, you shouldn't intrude on this, that, and the other, I think fail to understand this rather basic point. So this holistic learner is someone who's got an identity, and of course the identity is going to be something that gets communicated. Communication is part of learners' old knowledge. They already know at least one language, and that's the medium through which they live their daily lives. They use language to communicate, and they use it to think. They've got a large stock of conscious, but especially unconscious linguistic knowledge, for example, lexical and syntactic and pragmatic knowledge. And this knowledge provides the inevitable scaffold on which they consciously and unconsciously construct their target language. Now, I'm not here arguing that the learner's first language has an explicit role in the teaching approaches of the autonomy classroom. What I'm saying is that in each learner's head, there is a first language that provides a scaffold on which they will inevitably, gradually construct the target language. If we feel they don't know how to communicate with one another in the target language, that may be true, but only to a certain extent, because they know how to communicate with one another in their first language. Second language development depends absolutely crucially on second language use. You won't find any theory of second language acquisition that doesn't assign a central role to using the language. And Zoll has this to say. He's not talking about language learning, he's talking about learning in general. He says language has special characteristics that make it a wonderful tool for learning and an almost essential tool for demonstrating what we've learned. But at its heart, language is also about images. Now think about that. We learn through language, but if we're learning a language, the language we're learning, as I'm arguing, is the medium of that learning. But language is also about images, and that explains why it is so important, especially in the early stages, to combine written text with images in the autonomy classroom. We have an identity which we communicate gradually through the target language. And through communication, we get to agency again. We exercise our agency, of course, when we make choices, take decisions, act on them with a particular goal in view, and evaluate outcomes. Zoll says, one important rule for helping people learn is to help the learner feel she's in control. We've known that for a very long time in autonomy circles. It chimes, of course, with what Ed Deci says about our emotional and psychological need for autonomy, the importance of feeling, as he puts it, free and volitional in one's actions. And as I'm now saying for I think the fourth time, the exercise of agency in and through the target language is the key factor in explaining how and why language learner autonomy works. Identity, communication, agency, and then reflection. Because the exercise of agency requires reflection. Purposeful action is impossible unless we think what we're doing when we make plans, implement them, and evaluate the success of their implementation. Zoll again, he says, for me, reflection is mental images and bits of language. Again, image, the visual, and language. The part of the brain we use, he says, to see images with our mind's eye is the same part that we use to see them with our real eyes. Interesting thought. When I reflect, he goes on, I may find fragments of sentences, or I may be speaking mentally to myself. In the autonomy classroom, of course, we formalize reflection and evaluation in the target language in order to help learners develop a capacity for involuntary reflection, also in the target language. Identity, communication, agency, reflection, and then interaction. Because in an autonomy classroom, and this was the thing that Leni particularly emphasized when she reminded us of the so-called Bergen definition. In an autonomy classroom, learners collaboratively construct the target language. Learning is not all inside the head. Learning in a community is interactive, and interactive learning is, among other things, physical. Changing groups, moving around, creating artifacts, handling artifacts, all of this helps the learning process. And Zoll says, we cannot understand anything unless we create internal neuronal networks that reflect some set of physical relationships that accurately map the relationships in the concept. At a minimum, we must be sure that our students have connections of this sort. We must push them to tell us their metaphors or stories. So identity, communication, agency, reflection, interaction, and memory and story. Because learning and using a language depends crucially on memory. Zoll has interesting things to say about the interdependence of episodic and semantic memory. That's to say, memory for events and actions and processes, and memory for facts and states and whatnot. Also explicit and implicit memory. There's not time here for me to elaborate on that. But I thought this was a very interesting thing. Recalling and creating stories are key parts of learning. We remember by connecting things with our stories. We create by connecting our stories together in unique and memorable ways, and we act out our stories in our behaviours. Now, in the autonomy classroom, those things that I described earlier on as second-order tools mediating target language use, logbooks and posters, they progressively constitute the story of individual and collective learning. And they are what learners can constantly refer to and draw upon as they learn more, but also as, in the interests of their learning, they use what they already have. have identity, communication, agency, reflection, interaction, memory, and story, and I left till last motivation. And I left it till last because for me, it's the least important. You get no learning at all without intrinsic motivation. And Zoll puts it like this, fairly brutally: we may get people to do things with extrinsic rewards, but we can't get them to learn. The first thing our controlling brain sees in a reward or punishment, he goes on, is loss of control. It may not be a conscious recognition, but the brain evolved to detect and resist exactly this type of thing for over 5 million years. It's nice to think, isn't it, of little classes of skin-clad learners of the next Neanderthal dialect as their minds or brains gradually evolve. If we want to help people learn, Zoll says, we must help them see how it matters in their lives. And that's the whole business of focusing on the here and now and engaging learners in collaboratively developing this self-renewing dynamic. It's worth just slipping in a reference to John Dewey because he makes a very similar point. He says it's interest. He actually treats interest as more or less a synonym for identity. It's interest in the occupation as a whole, that is its continuous development, which keeps a pupil at his work in spite of temporary diversions and unpleasant obstacles. And if you can crack that in that kind of way by enacting, operationalizing, implementing version 2 of learner autonomy, then all this stuff on motivation is something you just don't need to bother with. So there we have it: identity, communication, agency, reflection, interaction, memory, and story, and motivation. They are, of course, as I've said, not a taxonomy. I'm not saying that these are the components which you add up. I'm just saying these are different perspectives. And as I've spoken, although I've had to go rather quickly through my argument, I'm sure you've seen how there has been overlap from one perspective to another. Let me conclude very quickly. An autonomous language learning environment, according to my version 2, is one that recognizes that learners' identity has a key role to play. Engaging learners, exploiting old knowledge, recognizing that because they already speak a language for communicative purposes, but also for metacognitive purposes, they have in their heads some deep-lying capacities onto which you can put the target language. Exploiting, therefore, their existing linguistic knowledge and communicative competence. Insisting that from the beginning they exercise agency in and through the target language. Develops their metacognitive proficiency in the target language through reflection. Recognizes that it's not all inside the head, it's a social and physical as well as a cognitive phenomenon. Uses logbooks and posters and other target language products to construct the story of individual and collective learning. And understands that we solve the motivational problem by exploiting learners' intrinsic motivation. 2 thoughts to conclude. The findings of neuroscience, as in a very preliminary and superficial way I've tried to illustrate, tend to confirm what successful practitioners of language learner autonomy version 2 have always known. But new developments in theories of language acquisition and motivation, the so-called social turn, are only just now beginning to catch up with those of us who've been successful practitioners of this version of learner autonomy. That's it. I don't know whether Anya was signaling that I was 5 minutes over. I was. I'm sorry. I'll do penance at some later date. Thank you very much.